Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if we can make a start, please. Okay, let's begin with our afternoon's proceedings. I can appreciate that I said at the just beforehand I'd encourage you all to talk, and that's fantastic. But now stop talking, because now we need to crack on. So. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for the conversations over lunchtime. I do hope that they were worthwhile. If anybody did have a conversation with somebody new, and as a result, something different might happen, will you let me know? Because it's always good to find out what happens as a result of events like this. Also, thanks to those of you who've been tweeting on the old hashtag there. Appreciate your comments. If I can encourage you to do that as well over the course of this afternoon, that would be great. Mark introduced me earlier, so I didn't get the chance to do the full introduction this morning. So I'll just take a couple of minutes to say a few things that I wanted to say at the outset and then get the opportunity to do so. So I'm Chris Matthews. My day job is Head of Sustainability at United Utilities, but it is a great privilege to be the Vice Chair of the Natural Capital Group here across Greater Manchester. Now, this is the 5th annual conference that we are hosting. And what I wanted to call out this morning before we started is what I'm detecting as a bit of a shift in the conversations that are taking place at gatherings like this. 5 years ago, we gathered because we felt we needed to make an argument and we needed people to listen to us, that natural capital needed to be part of the fabric of the combined authority, that it needed to be embedded in the way that it thinks and the way that it does things. I think today we can say that job is well and truly underway, and in fact, as you've heard from this morning's speakers, and particularly from Alex, natural capital now very much is a part of the thinking within the combined authority. So that's a huge, huge step forward. But I'd actually argue that that's the easy bit. And I know a lot of people here, including Mark, who's just smirked at that comment, will think, my goodness me, I've lost years getting to this point. And it's been hard work, don't get me wrong, of course it has. But that's the enabling environment we've now created. The real challenge ahead of us is now the doing. And I think it's upon every one of us in the room here, with the talent, the inspiration, the energy, the motivation, to actually take advantage of the enabling environment that's being created to do something about it. I don't think any longer we can turn around and say, actually, it's somebody else's job over there. Because I think that's been done. There's still work to be done, of course there is, but I actually think it's now for all of us to take the opportunities that are being presented to make it happen. And sometimes that comes about through chance conversations at events like this, or because you've been hearing about opportunities and actually you see the advantage to you and your organisation in engaging in those opportunities and driving them to make them happen. And it happened with us at United Utilities, the sustainable drainage example that some of you may hear about later on, already did this morning. 3 or 4 years ago, we had no idea where it would end up, and now it's part of a £4 or £5 million bid to see how we can get financial mechanisms to deliver wider sustainable and surface water management flow benefits across an urban environment. So who knows where these things head? You just know that it's the right direction. It's worth investing some time and effort. So I really would encourage you all to now think about what you can do to make this happen, rather than it being about making the case for change. What we're going to do this afternoon is pretty much repeat the way this morning worked. We've got a few speakers to talk to you in a moment or two. We're going to do it slightly different. We're going to do some Q&A after each of our speakers. Unfortunately, they're not able to stay later on. And then we're going to go back into the seminar groups, repeat the same process as this morning, but obviously you'll be in different rooms with different groups. And then we'll come back here and we'll have a conversation about the feedback from the seminars that have taken place this afternoon as well as this morning. So the speaking sessions will run till about 2 o'clock, and then when those sessions are over, I'll direct you to the rooms again, where there'll be the seminars running before we then will gather back in here for the wrap-up. Conscious of the weather, conscious that it'll be particularly cold this evening, an absolute commitment to finish at 4:30, which is the scheduled time, and we will shave a bit of time off if we overrun in any of the remaining agenda. I think it's very important people do feel they can get away in good time this evening. The last thing I'll mention, I might mention it a couple of times across the course this afternoon, there are going to be some feedback forms given out. I don't know if it was mentioned this morning. They are important feedback forms, not just to help shape future events, but there's actually money attached to this. It's a requirement for the funding of the event that we get some feedback. So please do give us your feedback, otherwise that might cause a few headaches for those who look after the pennies. That's all I wanted to say by way of some introductory remarks from me. So I'm now going to move on to our afternoon speakers. And firstly, I'd like to welcome, I think it's the first double act, so I can see Becky's here, but I can't spot Mick. There he is. Thank you, Mick. Come up and join Becky up front. Becky's Head of Sustainability at Heathrow, and Mick Weston, I think we know to a number of you, Head of Operations at the Lancashire Wildlife Trust. And they are here to talk about the GM wetlands carbon trading proposals, how it came about, what they've learnt, and perhaps importantly, which is maybe some of the theme I just talked about, actually how that learning can be transferred for wider delivery. And if you think in the context of the Natural Capital Investment Plan, perhaps there's some links between what they'll say and some of the opportunities within that and the habitat and carbon banking model. Without further ado, Becky and Mick, it's over to you guys.
Thank you. I feel like I have to justify why Heathrow Airport is here, because the few people I've spoken to since arriving have all raised their eyebrows at me. Why are you here? And it's because of this project, so a partnership that we have with Mick and the Lancashire Wildlife Trust. So I'm just going to start off by just explaining why have we got involved, why are we doing this project, and why does it matter, and Mick will help bring that to life. And also just talk a little bit about what we think the next steps are for this project, but also what it could mean for aviation, the aviation industry more generally, and perhaps some opportunities that you can link into here as well. So in terms of peatland, I've heard it mentioned in certainly even just the one session that I heard earlier as clearly an exceptionally important resource and an exceptionally important carbon store. So peatland represents only 3% of our global land surface, but it holds 550 billion tonnes of carbon. So incredibly important. In the UK, as many of you will be aware, particularly in this region, peatlands are a really important habitat. They bring a lot in terms of biodiversity, flood management, climate change, drinking water, and of course the kind of ecological and cultural heritage as well. Over 80% of the UK's 2.7 million hectares are degraded. So there's a lot of work to do. We also know that they're releasing 16 million tonnes of carbon a year. And to give you an idea of context, that's about a third of the UK's annual aviation emissions. So if we can do something about that, it makes a real difference. So I think the thing that really attracted us to peatland was, you know, it's difficult in aviation. Carbon is a very contentious issue. It is the clear big impact from growing aviation and the number of flights. And we know we've got to do something about it. And in many areas, we are reducing carbon emissions, but there are some with long-haul flights that there aren't solutions to that we can see at the moment. I believe there will be in the future. And earlier, late last year, we published something called our Carbon Neutral Growth Roadmap, which set out how we think we can get there. But for the moment, there are some areas where offsetting is going to be needed. So peatland is really important and interesting for us because of that kind of double win, I guess, that you can reduce emissions and also create the potential to lock away more carbon, store more carbon in the future. So in terms of why is Heathrow looking at this right now? So, I mean, it's important to say that the priority is reducing our emissions first. So we have very strong commitments in our Heathrow 2.0 sustainability plan that we launched back in 2017. So we're committed to being a zero carbon airport by 2050. We're already carbon neutral on electricity, so all of our electricity is from renewable sources. We do a huge amount of energy demand management to reduce what we're using. We've trialled green gas in Terminal 2, so that terminal is now powered by a mixture of on-site renewables, biomass, solar, and green electricity and gas. So we know we're going in the right direction. But as I mentioned, not all of it can be done now. And we've also said that we want, when we expand, so as many of you will know, there is going to be a third runway at Heathrow. When that is open in around 2026, we've committed that we will offset the growth in emissions from the extra flights that come with that runway. So it's really important to us that we do have offset as a tool. What's been interesting for us, I think, there has been some negative press about carbon offsetting over the years, but when we were looking at our plan in 2017, it was really clear that there are now different ways of doing offsetting. There are high quality offsets, and peatland restoration really stood out as an example of that high quality offset. And coming out and it was also important to us that we worked with a partner who could, who knew the area, who had experience of working, and what the right restoration techniques are. So we connected up with the Wildlife Trusts. A number of proposals came forward in different parts of the UK, and for a number of reasons we chose Little Walden Moss, which Mick will bring to life for you a bit more in a few moments, but many of you may know it as it's not far from here. There are really three reasons why we chose that. So already some restoration work has been going on at that site, led by DEFRA. So it made sense to put our resources into that as well. Secondly, it's accessible. So this is a pilot project. We want people to see it. We want to share. We want people to learn from our experience. So it's important that it's somewhere that people can get out to easily. And we believe it's a really compelling story because it is a site that has suffered degradation over the years, and by doing this, it shows that you can reverse that.
Wetland habitat, and they generally form in areas of high rainfall. So you can see there's large areas around the uplands of Wales, up the Pennine Ridge there, and obviously lots in Scotland. As I said, developing in areas of high rainfall, Manchester's quite well represented. But there's two sorts of peatlands effectively. You've got the upland peat, which is blanket bog. Around this area we call them the moors, the people we're very familiar with. We've got the West Pennine Moors, Saddleworth Moors, natural flood management, etc. But we've also got the lowlands, known locally as the mosses, and they're also very real characterised habitat of Greater Manchester. There's lots of places named after moss in Manchester, Moss Side and Carrington Moss. And on the zooming in on there, on the right-hand side, you've got the Great Manchester Wetlands NIA. Now this is a partnership project of local authorities, statutory organisations, charities, community groups, etc. And it's an area of focus really of 480 square kilometres where these organisations are coming together to look how we can use innovative approaches to habitat improvements. And right in the centre of this area here, you've got this big white area which is effectively chat moss. It's an area of lowland raised mire. Most of the habitat is now gone. In fact, 97% of this habitat's been lost in the UK. And it's very degraded in this instance as well. So you've got, within that area, you've got three remaining triple SIs, which are remnants of what was once the largest lowland raised mire in England. And they've now been designated as an SAC, a Special Area of Conservation. There's only 3 such sites in Greater Manchester. And they're critically important, but they need joining up because they're very isolated habitats as it stands. Our site, Little Walden Moss, sits in the middle of those sites. So that's an aerial photograph of Little Walden Moss. You can see the surrounding landscape is largely agricultural. The moss itself, this photograph was taken about 2012, I suspect, when we purchased it using Heritage Lottery Fund funding. And it looked like this. It was one big brown expanse of bare peat. You can see the peat extraction going on the slide here and the vegetation-free surface. Now, not only is the peat being harvested and taken off, and the carbon involved in the heat that's being harvested is lost fairly quickly, but the surface of the moss is emitting carbon at quite a rate. In order to lock in that carbon again, we really needed to be re-wetting that habitat through a number of fairly simple processes, and I'll show you some of those now. This isn't rocket science. This has been done many, many times over. It's a simple process of taking the bare peat surface, infilling the ditches, creating new bunds, putting water level management in. You've got volunteers down here on the left planting sphagnum moss and other mossland plants. And in the bottom right, you've got a fairly early stage of restoration of that bare peat surface. Now, at that time, you really need to be developing that vegetation. It's the process of carbon storage in a moss is effectively because the rate of growth basically exceeds the rate of decomposition. So you get this build-up of plant material with the carbon being deposited. From the Wildlife Trust point of view, we obviously get a benefit there in terms of the unique wildlife that these sites support. As I said, the three sites combining the SAC, they're still degraded, but they're in much, much better condition, obviously. And they support a very characteristic wildlife here. So we've got common lizard, short-eared owl. Bottom left here, we've got sundew, which is an insectivorous plant, which is quite unique to mosses. We've got the adder there that occurs on Risley Moss in Warrington. Top right, we've got sphagnum moss, which is effectively the building block of these habitats, and that's ultimately where the carbon is stored. Peat is just really non-decomposed sphagnum moss. And on the bottom right is a large heath butterfly. Now, this was discovered at Chatmoss over 200 years ago, 1795, and was known locally as the Manchester Argus. 100 years later, it was extinct from Manchester, but still hangs on in a few populations in North Lancashire. So over the next couple of years, we have funding for a programme to reintroduce the Manchester Argus back to Manchester on the sites where it is suitable. And it's hoped that with the intervention money from DEFRA and from Heathrow, that Little Walden Moss will ultimately become suitable for the Manchester Argus to return as well. As Becky said, it's very close to major conurbations. It's a very accessible site. Part of the site's been restored already, as we said, using HLF and DEFRA money, but around about a third of the site, the peat extraction only finished about a year ago, so there's still a heck of a lot of work to do there. But on the partially restored bit, we've been having school visits on a regular basis. Local community groups have been visiting the site. Bear in mind, it's a site that was never visited. It was, it was just off the radar for any members of the local community. Bottom right, we've got some volunteers. We've got a very active volunteer and friends of group there at Chatmoss. And in the bottom left here, even the Greater Manchester Mayor took time to come and enjoy the site. So there are obvious benefits from the Wildlife Trust's perspective there in nature and accessibility. In terms of carbon, fortunately, the very process of managing these sites for wildlife is also the best way of managing them for storing carbon. On this site, as it stands, over the next 30 years, the habitat improvements that we're doing now should save over 22,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. In terms of things that we've learned from this process, it's trying to find a reliable way of actually measuring that carbon saving. As we said with peatlands, it's a double whammy. You get most of the carbon saving is from preventing the emission from the degraded bog. On top of that, you then get a carbon sequestration to the site by the accumulation of new peat as you re-establish the sphagnum surface. So, I mean, this actually isn't at Little Walden Moss. It's about half a mile down the road or a mile down the road at Chatmoss, but it shows very clearly the contrast between a partially restored site there and the peat extraction sites beyond. We're very keen to expand this approach. This has been extremely beneficial for us. Without the intervention money from Heathrow, we'd have struggled to pay for all the staff time and all the resources we need to restore Little Walden Moss. I think what's very evident with this is that probably that carbon saving on its own may not in the future justify the cost of restoring these bogs on its own, but this is only partially funded by Heathrow and partially funded by DEFRA. And I think particularly when we're looking at the uplands, it's really important that we look at all of the ecosystem services that are being delivered by this process, whether it be carbon saving, natural flood management, prevention of fires by keeping the site wetter in the summer. And it's this concept of these stackable ecosystem services, stackable benefits, which different beneficiaries may, with different agendas, may be prepared to contribute to. And I think the key thing from this is, you can talk about these things forever, but the real way of going forward is to learn by doing. And this is the first pilot project. So once we finish this, we'll be dissecting the results and hopefully taking that on to the next stage. Okay, I'll pass back over to Becky.
Thanks, Mick. Yeah, so as Mick says, this is an important project, and to connect with what I said earlier, we're doing this initially because we know there are some of our own operating emissions at Heathrow that we won't be able to reduce within the next couple of years. But actually what's really exciting here is the wider opportunity for aviation. So some of you may know, some may not. Back in 2016, ICAO, that's the UN body for international aviation, they agreed with governments around the world a really groundbreaking deal. So this was that the increase in emissions from after 2020, that those governments would sign up to the airlines, that their airlines would offset those. So after 2020, 90% of the countries in the world, their airlines will be offsetting any growth in emissions. It's initially a voluntary scheme, but by 2027, it becomes mandatory. And what that means, so the name of that scheme is CORSIA that you see there. So what that means is there's going to be a huge increase in demand for carbon offsetting projects by those airlines and the aviation industry. And ICAO themselves have estimated that that's going to be worth around $40 billion between the period you see there, so 2021 when this starts to 2035, which is as far as they've looked. That's a lot of money, a lot of investment. And what we're interested in here is really proving that these UK land-based projects are eligible and viable for this kind of investment. So our aim with this project was to try it out, prove that it can work. And I think you made an important point there, Mick, that it may be that some of these become, in the medium term, are not affordable on their own. But if we can look at these stackable benefits and making a case that, for example, a water company can also derive some ecosystem benefits that are important to them out of it, then the whole case stacks up and you can make it work. The critical thing will be the eligibility criteria for CORSIA, which are due to come out, we think, in June or July this year. So what we're trying to do at the moment is get the message about this project out, show that it works, and really encourage them to include this kind of model within it. I think this point has really already been made mostly, so we want to collaborate, we really do. So we're doing this to learn. We want to share absolutely everything. It's not always the case in business, but with this it is. So we're definitely talking to people in other sectors as well as within aviation. And actually, one thing I didn't mention with this project now is that we do have an airline, British Airways. Their carbon fund has also put in some of the investment to this project as well. So because they are absolutely going to be investing themselves in CORSIA once the deadline passes at the end of 2020. So yeah, very keen to collaborate, for example, with the water sector, but elsewhere as well. And we're also beginning to think more broadly. So this has been our first step and has gone well. So kind of building on what we've heard from the government in the 25-year environment plan, we're looking at soil carbon farming. Can we invest with landowners and farmers to look at offsetting projects with them as well? So we definitely plan to expand and go further. We're looking at an upland peat restoration project, potentially likely to be in Wales. We're also looking at carbon farming, as I just mentioned, perhaps in Scotland, but looking across the entire of the UK. Wait to see what happens with Corsia, but we're continually making the case for this and getting that message across. And we just really believe that this is an innovative way to attract investment into UK land, and we want to keep pushing that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Becky and Mick. And I was just quite taken by the 97% of, say, lowland peat that's been lost. And when you hear stats like that, it reminds me of something, I think it was the Prince of Wales said at an event last year, which is we're the first generation to know that actually there's irreversible damage or happening, but we're also the last generation who can do something about it. So it's just back to this point of action, which is, I think, every stat we're hearing, we know there's an issue. So actually, how do we translate that into action? And we just had a perfect example of perhaps a sector you wouldn't necessarily think would be thinking that way, is actually recognising there's a responsibility to do something and trying to find a good way of doing it with partners that are there who can deliver good solutions on the ground. As I said earlier, we're going to have questions for you two now. We've got time for one or two questions, if there are any. If not, you get off scot-free. So is there anybody who'd like to ask a question from the floor? I've seen Mark's hand go up, so anybody else? I'll take your question first, Mark.
So if you have the results, can you give us an indication of what the cost per tonne of carbon offset is? And if you don't have those results, could you give us an indication of what you think an acceptable cost per tonne of carbon offset is?
I just want to turn this one on, because I don't know how to do it. That'd be great.
The answer is no, we don't, not yet. I'm not able to give you that answer right now. Sorry, I'm not close enough to it. So it's just the honest answer.
If you hold that microphone there, Becky.
Yeah.
Right, so I saw a couple of hands down here.
Thank you.
So,
Emma Knightstrong from Green Arch Consulting. I have a question. I know that the shipping industry has recently identified that they're on board for offsetting carbon emissions as well. Has the aviation industry looked into, I appreciate we're talking about on land-based offsets at the moment, but marine-based offsets, and also is the aviation industry speaking with the shipping industry about the experience that you have to date, and maybe thinking about collaborating in some of those areas?
Thank you. I'll take that one. So in answer to your first question, yes, we absolutely are looking at all sorts of different options. I mean, there's two things here. One is Corsia as an overall framework, and there are many parties, because it is an international negotiation, who are involved in that. So there is a very long and rigorous process, so they are looking at many, many types. It will come down to eligibility criteria and whether or not those kinds of other projects would meet those standards. But I think it looks very likely. To your second point, yes, there is definitely some discussion, because within the transport sector more widely, I think it's very understood that there are challenges that both aviation and shipping do face. It's not a common meeting of kind of industries, if I'm honest. So it's a good point to raise, and probably we could do more.
Hi, it's just a question in relation to how you engage the landowners who are currently occupying these areas that you want to increase. I think the conversation you would have with a farmer who you wanted to restore moor is very different to the conversation you would have with a farmer who's currently occupying and managing the moss, considering the margins that you're actually taking from that land. So I'm just wondering, what conversations, how much, are you having with these landowners, considering that land that you want to restore is probably some of the most productive land in the northwest?
Okay, I mean, obviously this is a pilot project, and whilst we've been developing this pilot, there have been discussions about, there was a number of proposals put forward, weren't there? And some of these do involve working with other partner landowners. I mean, obviously in the uplands, we sometimes have landowners that own vast tracts of land. some of which are managed beneficially, some not, unfortunately. But I think there's definitely a case that it's going to take a little bit longer and a little bit more negotiation to work with those large landowners. But then again, at the same time, there are other major landowners, such as water companies, who I think would very much embrace this agenda. So obviously this is a pilot at this stage, but there's huge opportunity, I think, in that area. Just on the lowland side, you did mention carbon farming, didn't you? We have received some further European funding to trial sphagnum farming effectively adjacent to lowland raised mire sites, to see if we can come up with beneficial management there that won't compromise the bog itself but will still get a return for the farmer. So some interesting pilots in process at the moment.
The only point that I would add to that is that it's for this exact reason that we will always work with a partner who has those relationships and knows how to balance the different needs and requirements. So on the agriculture side, there's some other partners in that sector that we're talking to, because we do recognise as an airport we only go so far with our knowledge in this area.
Thank you both very much. Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Mick. Safe onward journeys when you depart. If I could now welcome up, brilliant, Dan Hurd is going to talk to us about lessons from the social investment market. I think what's really important, and we've just heard there about a pilot, is start small things and let's learn and see if we can scale up. But also we shouldn't be shy to go and learn from other sectors and other markets as well. I think that's exactly what you're going to cover for us, isn't it, Dan? Learnings from the social investment market and how they cut across into the natural capital world. So over to you, Dan. Here's the mic.
Thanks a lot. Afternoon, everyone. So I'm Dan. I look after the corporate finance side at Triodos Bank. We're a European ethical bank, one of the largest in Europe, one of the first ethical banks in the world, actually. And we fund projects which deliver social and environmental value. So most of my banking colleagues do straightforward bank lending. The bit that I look after is raising risk finance for organisations where normal secure bank lending is outside of the typical bank's risk appetite. So many projects, many NGOs have great projects. They want to raise capital. They don't have a freehold property available, but they need to raise risk capital to develop their business. And that's the type of work that we get involved in, and that could be through investment crowdfunding from retail investors all the way through to raising capital from ethical institutional investors. So I think we can firmly say that natural capital as a sector is outside the normal banking space. Okay, so it's risk capital that we need to get this whole sector moving. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a spin through the example of the social investment sector, which we've been working in for about 10 years, and see what sort of learning we can have from that space. So if you go back about 5 or 6 years, with austerity kicking in, government starting to reduce grants to local authorities, government saying to local authorities, you need to do more with less. The reality of the situation at the time was there are still intractable social problems, and there still are, around rough sleeping, children in care, domestic violence, mental health. All these things haven't gone away just because we haven't got as much money as we used to have. And obviously the public sector funding constraints create a massive problem for local authorities to continue delivering services. So the government's great idea at the time was, yep, we know the problems are still there. You can't rely on us for as much money as you used to have. So you now need to bring in private sector capital to try to tackle some of these problems. So a seemingly impossible task for local authority commissioners. How can anybody make any money out of tackling homelessness or mental health? It surely isn't possible. It's got to be done through a grant. And obviously what I'm doing here is trying to provide a bit of a mirror across to natural capital, which I'll do in a minute. But this is where the social investment space was 5 years ago. And the reality is that with a bit of innovation in the way in which people look at investment and revenue streams, this sector has in fact taken off. It's quite controversial because it's quite politically loaded, the whole thing. But the reality is there are a range of both proven and innovative solutions to various social problems which have emerged over the last 5 years, where a local authority commissioner might pay for some of these, but maybe in the absence of the funding that they used to have, they would pay for it on an outcomes basis. And they would only pay for those outcomes if they result in cost savings. So local authority commissioners are starting to think more differently about what they actually use their limited funding for. So a slight change in commissioning behaviour, moving away from fee for service into payment by results, perhaps looking at what they will pay for a successful outcome, only things which can generate a cost saving. And what that's done really is it's created a series of revenue streams. And the revenue streams are in fact a share of the cost of doing nothing. So if rough sleeping costs a local authority 100, would a local authority pay 50 to tackle rough sleeping and bank the other 50? And maybe they'd only pay that 50 if the intervention was successful, which means the local authority is shifting the risk away onto somebody else. They're shifting the risk onto the homeless charity who wants to deal with the people who are rough sleeping. But the homeless charity is a charity, and it doesn't want to take the risk of recruiting a team of people to work with people on the street. So it wants to shift the risk away somewhere else. So that risk is actually shifted away to a socially motivated investor. And what we found is those investors actually are out there. So the question is, socially motivated risk capital available from the private sector? The last 5-6 years would tell us, yes, it is. And the word socially motivated is important here. We're not talking about venture capital investment, a different type of investor. So if we move on and say, let's just draw a parallel with the natural capital sector, we're in a situation where we've got intractable, and the green word is simply a swap of social to environmental, intractable environmental problems, which we've all been talking about all day. We all know they're there. And we have public sector funding constraints because of the grants, perhaps, that many of you have been used to over the years, are more difficult to get hold of and can't be assumed to be there forever. So a new solution to funding how we tackle environmental problems needs to be found. So I'd say that, again, similar to the social space, there are a range of innovative environmental interventions available. We've heard about a few of them today. Many of you in the room know what the interventions need to be. You've got evidence base for many of them. You just need the funding and the structure to get them implemented. The revenue streams in the natural capital space are actually more varied than the social space. We aren't just talking about a share of cost savings. There are other revenue streams that could be stacked onto top of each other to provide an investable model, and we'll move on to that. But then the question is, are there any investors in this space who are interested? The nearest you're going to get today to an investor is probably Louise this morning and myself, because we're financial intermediaries and we raise money for our clients. There aren't actually any investors in this space at the moment because there haven't really been any deals which anyone's invested in. So we are at the very, very start of this. So I have to put a question mark by that. But I would say that most of the social investors, who are generally charitable foundations, family offices, some high net worth individuals, some philanthropists, who've all come in and found a way to invest in the social space, they really are there if we can develop some investable models. So I'm quite confident on that front. So what's also important is to talk about the role of government. Because in the social space, it didn't suddenly go from being everything grant funded to local authority to suddenly everything funded by the private sector. The government had to play a facilitating role. And it did actually talk to the sector and say, well, how can we play this role? And I think DEFRA, in the natural capital space, can play a similar role. And we can learn from the social sector and give DEFRA a bit of a steer as to what they need to do to get this whole sector moving. So this is the way a typical payment for outcomes structure works in the social sector. What I've put up there is what's called a social impact bond, which many of you will have heard of, particularly those of you who work for local authorities. And really a social impact bond is simply a way of managing a transaction where you have a commissioner at the top, a local authority, who issues a payment by results contract into the market. And that might be a contract using the homeless thing again to say, we'll offer a contract in Manchester for somebody to come and bid for this who can tackle rough sleeping in Manchester. And we'll pay based on outcomes, and we'll give you a list of the 200 people who are currently rough sleeping in Manchester, and we'll even give you the locations where they are. This is actually a live program that's happened around the country. So Manchester City Authority put that contract out into the market. A number of third sector organisations come and bid for it. They know that they need to invest maybe £1 million to create a team of 12, 15 people who can go out and become link workers and work with those rough sleepers for a period of 2 or 3 years. So that is the intervention that's needed to get these people off the street. We're talking about entrenched rough sleeping, a really intensive programme, sort of 1 to 4 client type support with accommodation, mental health, addiction services all available. But of course those third sector organisations can't fund that off their own balance sheet, they're charities. So what we bring in is the social investors. So the social investors come in with the risk capital to fund the NGO, to recruit the team, to then work on the transaction. And that way a PBR contract gets developed. And that is a social impact bond. So that all sounds very complicated and difficult to pull together for all parties actually. And it might take 6 months, a year to pull that whole transaction together, because the local authority's got to go through a commissioning process. All the charities have all got to put a bid together. They're spending a lot of management time bidding for this single contract. Then all these charities have got to go out and raise investment and convince investors that they're investable and that their intervention will work. Because investors look at this quite commercially. They know they can tick the social box straight away, but they are still then looking at the delivery body and saying, will I get my money back? So this is all quite complicated. And there needs to be some support from government to get this whole sector moving. So what the government did 5 years ago was created this thing called Life Chances Fund, which was an £80 million fund to encourage exactly this type of transaction, encourage local authorities to start commissioning these types of things in this way. And what the fund was announced in the spending review. It was 80 million made up of various different bits. The first bit was a fund of 10 million, which was available for technical assistance. So the charities could bid for development grants to help them recruit advisors to help put their bid and their business plan and their funding application together. So the charities got some support. The government then provided a top-up funding to local authorities. So to try to convince local authorities to go down this route, the government said, well, for every £1 that you pay for outcomes, we'll give you 40p. So the government really is trying to encourage local authorities to go down this new type of commissioning route. So that was about 70 million of the 80 million was in that space. And what the government also did is introduced a brand new tax relief called Social Investment Tax Relief, which allowed investors to receive 30% of their investment up front as a tax relief. So you can see that this was all put together by DCMS. There's quite a range of measures there designed to move and create a brand new market. And all of this was absolutely critical, actually, to get all these parties involved and moving. So the question is, where are we now, 5 years later? Does it work? Well, there is some encouraging news. The UK is a world leader, actually, in payment for outcomes commissioning. We have various delegations coming over from US, Canada, Japan to see what's been done in the UK. It's one of the few areas where we are a world leader, probably. But there's about 50 or 60 of these types of transactions in the UK at the moment. There are around about 10 social investment funds who regularly invest in this space. And within local authorities, payment for outcomes commissioning is becoming more and more prevalent. So it is catching on, and people are understanding how it works. So we can give ourselves a bit of a gold star on that side for that. I would say it's still a very contentious area. It's ideologically quite difficult. Many local authorities are very, very hostile to this because they believe that the government should still be increasing the size of the government grant, and these types of services should be grant funded and not be going through some sort of private sector investment process. So I think in the interest of balance, I would say that. And not all local authorities are at all interested in going down this route. So there's mixed success, is what I'd say. I think it's more controversial than natural capital, where I think everybody in the UK would admit we should be trying to do something about the environment. So in a way, we're in the slightly better space as a starting point. So just reiterating what I said, it has needed government support mechanisms, both money for top-up funding, investment readiness funding. There have been a few other bits of help as well, a thing called a social impact bond toolkit, which is sort of template contracts and things. So anything really that's needed to make this project work. So the natural capital sector, given that is where we are with the social sector, natural capital sector, there are some potential advantages. In the social sector, the only revenue stream was really a share of cost savings. Obviously in the natural capital sector, we can see from various projects there's a whole range of revenue streams. Water companies might be prepared to pay for clean water, flood defence. So an element of the water company engagement could be around cost savings. But of course there's also things like ecotourism, flood insurance, local authorities, both through Section 106, perhaps even nature-based prescribing. There's opportunities to sort of start building potential revenue streams for all these projects. Carbon offset, like we heard in the last example, you know, are there various corporates and airlines out there willing to pay for carbon sequestration? So you start to see a few little bits of evidence coming through. It might be that some projects have access to 3 or 4 of those different revenue streams. And where there are revenue streams, you can then attract capital. Without revenue streams, no investor is going to be remotely interested. You were talking about grant funding. So it is important just to keep coming back to that point. So an advantage in natural capital, there's much less reliance on public sector commissioning. You don't for some of these natural capital projects, we don't really even need to engage the local authority. So with a bit of support from DEFRA, with the Environment Agency playing a facilitating role, probably the water company playing some sort of role in most of these deals, different types of projects can be put together. We don't need sort of local authority procurement processes. Things can move a bit more quickly. I think there is some good learning as well that we can look back on in the social investment sector. So the question is, what next? The question everyone asks is, are there currently or likely in future to be enough investable deals? How can we as a group encourage government to support the sector, and what support should we be asking for? My sense is DEFRA aren't quite sure what support to give this whole sector, and it's all a little bit of an information gathering exercise for everyone at the moment. But I think one of the first places to look is to tell them to go across and talk to DCMS colleagues who've been supporting the social sector for the last 5-6 years. They have some very valuable learning, lots of things that haven't gone right as well as things that have gone well. So I think the role of DEFRA is quite critical to this, to actually get the whole sector moving. We're doing something just sort of off our own bat, really, and we in our work over the last 12 months or so, we got talking to various NGOs and various projects who came to us and said, well, Triodos, yeah, you raise money, don't you? Can you help us raise some capital for this project? And I said, well, actually, there's probably a bit of work needs to be done to get you to that point. So we decided that we had about 12, 15 projects that we could see had come to us that would require a bit more investigation on our part. And we thought it would be quite useful to share that evaluation of those projects with DEFRA, Environment Agency, and Esme Fairbairn Foundation. And so we said, why don't we do a little project, which is that we will review the 12 projects that have just come across our desk. This is without us going out and looking for them. They're sort of in the sector. We'll review all 12. We'll go and meet the proponents of those 12. Most of them are put forward by rivers trusts, wildlife trusts, and various other NGOs. Most of them involve multiple partners. There's always a water company there. Often the EA are there. Natural England are often there. You've sometimes got Floodry at the table. So real groups of partners, all different projects in different parts of the country, some catchment, some woodland, some urban. So a real nice representative sample of potential natural capital projects. So what we said to DEFRA, EA and VESME was, will all 3 of you club together, give us a little bit of money, and we'll go out and review those 12 projects and report back to you. DEFRA and EA immediately said, we haven't got any money and you'll have to go through procurement. So thankfully, Esme said, well, tell you what, to get things moving, we'll do it. So they've given us a grant, which is brilliant of them. And we're in the middle now of evaluating these projects. And what we're going to look at with our sort of financial hat on is, not only do these projects deliver great natural capital benefits, but will they ever become investable? And are the people putting them forward likely to be able to attract investment? Because it's quite an ask. If you're a chief executive of a wildlife trust, you're probably doing a great job getting hold of grants, sort of, and you know, managing donations and engaging the public. But you're now going to be asked to actually turn yourself into a bit more of a commercial animal and try and create a business model out of something. and maybe manage a contract with a water company or develop an ecotourism resort. So it's quite a big ask, actually, and investors are going to be saying, well, actually, we love what you've done and what you do, but this is new. Who has actually got the commercial acumen to actually manage and develop this project and give us some comfort that those revenue streams will be there? So what we're looking to do is recommend a short list of maybe 4 or 5 of those 12 for further development funding support, and we're going to share our findings and evaluation with DEFRA and Environment Agency. And what we're really trying to do, and I know there's some DEFRA people here, but make no apology, we're really trying to sort of say to DEFRA, look, there are some investable projects out there, they need some support, and this might be the type of thing you might try to ask for in the next comprehensive spending review. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Yeah. Sure. I was just asking Dan, what would be the one piece of advice he'd give us if we really wanted to unlock the natural capital challenge, taking the learnings from the social investment market? What would be the one thing he'd really call out to us?
I think that most of the potential projects out there need a bit of development support. A lot of people are putting it together probably in their spare time as part of another job they've got. And what's needed is a bit of development funding. I think that should come from DEFRA. So with a very relatively modest amount of development funding for this sector, that would give all of the guys in the NGOs a little bit of resource to actually concentrate properly on developing a business case and getting some early projects up and running. I think DEFRA is probably the right place to be going to ask for that funding.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else a question for Dan? Gentleman there.
You closed with the evaluation. What timescales will there be on that evaluation report? When do you think it might be available for circulation?
Oh, okay. Sorry, yeah. That report is actually a report for Esme Fairburn Foundation, so I'm not sure it's going to be publicly available. It's just our report to them. They've given us a grant to produce this piece of work. Yeah.
Is it likely they'll want to share that across
There is
the
somebody
sector?
from Esme Fairburn here, but I'm not going to put her on the spot and ask her.
Hello. So just wanted to ask a bit more about the share of cost-saving model and how that works and if there are any risks associated with that. You said some things have worked and some things hadn't, and what the benefits are of that model. So if something costs £100 and you're doing it for 50, how does that work?
Yeah. The most obvious one I've seen there is probably a contract with a water company, where I saw one where a Rivers Trust had put in place some interventions which improved the water quality downstream from a small treatment works for a water company. It was done as a partnership, and the water company actually funded that piece of work. And then both parties tested the water quality downstream of the intervention, and it had massively improved. So the challenge then is for the NGO to say to the water company, how about we deliver that intervention in 20, 30 other locations around the county? And what if the NGO said to the water company, you don't have to fund this, we'll go out and raise some investment and we'll fund it all. And actually all you have to do is pay us based on an actual outcome, which will be improved water quality to be measured and tested annually. That's quite a compelling offer to a water company. And the water company might be sitting there thinking, well, that's a good offer, that we'll compare that against us having to put in grey infrastructure and do all sorts of extra treatment ourselves. So they might say, well, actually, we're quite happy to let someone else take the capital cost and the risk. We'll pay for that on an outcomes basis, as long as what we pay is less than the actual cost of us putting that infrastructure in ourselves. And that just requires a sort of commercial proposal and negotiation between probably a rivers trust and a water company. Two parties at the table, you know, and it's really our payment by results contract with the water company happy that over a 10-year period, what they pay in outcomes would be less than what it would cost them to do it themselves. So that makes sense.
Thank you.
I suppose picking up from the last question, as someone who works for Ribble Rivers Trust and quite aware of quite a lot of those cost-saving mechanisms, my concern is whether there's a risk that it all then becomes a commercial transaction where actually it didn't need to be. So in the example you gave, it may actually be better for the water company just to pay, or for the Environment Agency to regulate them such that they have to pay for the wetland rather than the grey infrastructure, as opposed to Rivers Trust have to go out and seek finance to build that, to generate a revenue stream. I know it can work both ways in different scenarios, but my concern is this is new and shiny and very attractive, and actually it could end up replacing those situations where we don't need to look at finance.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you know a lot more about this than me. I'm just looking at it from a, you know, could it work as a financial model with learning from social sector? Yes, it could. The Rivers Trust in question that I was just talking about there said, well, actually the water company might decide it gets an offer from me, the Rivers Trust, or it then goes and talks to a large PLC contractor and just pays them to put the same infrastructure in place. The Rivers Trust would probably put the infrastructure in place, but would do it slightly differently because they'd be looking for slightly wider environmental gains out of that intervention compared to a mainstream listed engineering company. So one offers probably a wider natural capital benefit than the other, but for the water company, the second one is probably lower risk, isn't it? Actually doing a contract. But so I think there's really a choice there. Do Rivers Trust want to sort of play in that market, or maybe just influence what the intervention is instead of actually raising money and doing it? And remember, the money that's being raised is not being raised by the Rivers Trust onto its own balance sheet. You're not using the charity balance sheet here. We're talking about a special purpose vehicle probably, where it's held off balance sheet.
Thank you, Dan. I think wearing a water company hat, like any organisation, water companies themselves also do have some limits on what they can invest and spend, and sometimes finding alternative financial mechanisms that can bring investment into water-related problems that we all share and we all need to work together to solve might actually be the right answer. So I wouldn't like to portray the sector as having a blank check either, and we equally are looking for those opportunities too. So perhaps we need to have a conversation over coffee as well, Dan. So thank you very much for your contributions. It's very much appreciated. Indeed. And so now we're leaving for our second round of seminars. Hopefully you know where you're going. If you don't, because you might have been moved around, the details are on the sign. We're going to finish those seminars at 3:10, please. So if the seminar chairs can just shave off 5 minutes off their agenda, that would be great. And then if I can remind you, straight after that, there'll be refreshments back in this room, please, at 3:30. Thanks very much.
historically, environmental investment obviously has been a challenge in terms of getting the right amount of money through to deliver all the interventions we need. And as a water company particularly, one of the key kind of investors that's been targeted in that way. And what we are very interested in is how you can actually create a better marketplace for those catchment scale investments. So all of the people that are deriving benefit from that really understand the benefits that they're deriving and have that interest in actually contributing to the maintenance and upkeep of those and the investment in new assets to try and keep things progressing. And then we want to also be able to see how you can link that through to the supply side of that, so you can actually get that investment flowing through to the catchments far more efficiently to deliver some of those benefits. And that's sort of some of the work that we're working on with quite a lot of people and seeing how we can develop that. So I will hand over to Amanda very quickly. You've got less than 10 minutes this time.
I can do that.
To talk through our Suds for Schools model.
Fab. Thank you. So I've worked with business in the community for about 13 years, and I've been working on this water project for about 3 years now. First thing to get through this quicker is everyone aware what Suds are? Anyone not? Okay, that knocks off at least 2 minutes. So good. About 3 years ago, I was stood in a boardroom when we had 3 months worth of Environment Agency funding to test a proposition to see if it was possible to incentivise retrofitting Suds in schools by reducing charges, wastewater charges. The way that United Utilities charge non-domestic customers is by area of hard standing. So if you can disconnect a certain percentage of that hard standing from the wastewater system, you can move down a band, it's a banded system, and save money on an annual basis. The initial work was literally just looking to see if there was a viability behind that. We have a water task force that brings together water companies, engineering companies, varying other businesses, and they were steering this to go, okay, is there actually a model here that works? So the overview was going, is there a way in which schools in Greater Manchester can see a financial return through this? The reason we focused on schools was twofold. One, at that point in time, there was quite a bit of upset and media upset with United Utilities because they'd introduced this new charging, even though it was recognised by Ofwat, and they'd seen their water charges go up hugely. So there was a driver with you and all of our businesses and us to see if there was an opportunity to reduce this for schools, and also within Greater Manchester there was potentially a capital investment project to retrofit schools and improve the school premises, so killing 2 birds with 1 stone. At the point we started, there were over 1,000 schools in Greater Manchester, and they were at that point paying £4.3 million in surplus water charging over the year. So there was obviously quite an opportunity there to find savings. And the initial work literally just looked at that. We looked at going, okay, here are all the schools that exist within Greater Manchester. This is the band that they're in. These are where we could potentially put in Suds because it's down to ground conditions. And these are the savings that could potentially be made. And within the first 3 months of the project, we did create a model that looked at that, and we proved the fact that from a conceptual point of view, this had legs. It was worth putting more time into to see how it could be scaled up and where the options were. The next stage of that was going, okay, well, we know there's a direct financial benefit by saving, but actually there are huge, wider, multiple benefits that are available if you invest in blue and green Suds in particular, around health and well-being, reduced flood risk, biodiversity, air quality, education, a whole raft of them. And we looked at that and looked at bringing together some other models to see how we could value that. Bringing that all together, we did a third phase, which is just pretty much coming to the end now, where we went, okay, well, how can we actually demonstrate this at pilot? How can we bring together some other stakeholders who could help facilitate this and make this happen? How do we go wider than just schools? We started working with NHS Property Services and started engaging some of our businesses. And how do we make the model that we've got a bit more robust? Because it was very much, okay, let's see if there's legs in this, but it's not. If you put X in, you'll get Y out at the first point. So what we've delivered so far was the initial financial benefits that demonstrated that there was a business case there. We have a model around some of the multiple benefits and an attempt at putting some value against those multiple benefits. We have a pilot in a school in Greater Manchester, which was interesting because the school originally did this because we funded them to do it, and they went, oh great, we can make savings on our water. But actually what they've now seen is a huge benefit to themselves in terms of education, children's engagement, parents' engagement. They've got new parents looking around, and actually it's really attracting them to the school, so there's a lot of benefits. And we're now at the point of where that's going to scale up. So we looked at two models when we originally did this, schools and NHS sites. One where if you implemented SUDS in a site, if you only took sites that would get a direct return within their site by moving down a band, how many could we do and what would the return be over time? And then a second one, which meant if we do this at scale and we pool schools, where can we see about pooling the savings, sharing those across multiple sites, and by doing that, leverage more multiple benefits. If we can do this at greater scale, we've got a lot more benefits from the green-blue space that's created. What we found off the third stage of this is that potentially there are 249 schools and NHS sites that could potentially save over £300,000 a year, and there would be a return on their investment within 5 years. So after 5 years, there would be £300,000 a year of savings. If we extended the return period to 15 years, potentially 598 sites could invest in SUDS. They would look at saving over £800,000 a year between them, and they would create over 300,000 metres squared of green and blue space, which could potentially deliver over £83 million worth of social and environmental benefits. So the business case became really clear. There is a case there. There is a case for investing. So the multiple benefits that we looked at again and how this worked, we looked at two different models to look at the multiple benefits. One was UU's model that they've developed with Atkins, and one was Syria's BEST model. And this is a range of some of the benefits that we can see and how those are spread across. One of the key areas that we were focusing on as well is mental health and well-being and physical health and well-being, because that was one of the real drivers for NHS properties to come on board and work with us. They are in the process at the moment of we're delivering a pilot with them. For them, obviously cost savings are hugely important, but equally they're getting pressure to ensure that their premises also contribute towards positive health and mental well-being, both for their patients and for the staff. So the model got to, we developed that model and we launched that towards the end of last year, and we shared the report. And we also discovered there was quite a lot of interest in this, which was great. People started seeing that there was real value there. And when we're looking at natural capital, it was somewhere where you could see a direct financial return. So there was some funding from RICE, Revolving Instrument Cities Europe, as I said this morning, the most randomly titled fund ever. But that was a review that was done by Manchester City Council, we supported, and Atkins were contracted to deliver that. That looked at a few things. When it looked at the model that we've done and gone, okay, how do we make that more robust? We're aware that this is very much going okay. It gives you an idea of where we are, but it's not a strong financial model. So it reviewed the costs, both CapEx and OpEx. It checked some of the issues within the things and just made it a more robust model. It particularly focused on extending this in Manchester City Council area, Salford City Council area, and with Brentwood developments to see how that could be scaled up beyond schools and NHS sites in those areas. It also started looking at where those opportunities for financing could come from, and help developing a pipeline of opportunities. We were having a lot of conversations to see where else we have some real opportunities to bring people in to invest in blue-green subs in Greater Manchester. That's where we've kind of got to, and what's happened at that point is from 3 years ago when I was stood in this room going, okay, is this going to be possible? And we all thought, let's give it a try. We are now at the point where this has got £4 or £5 million worth of funding as part of the UIA Ignition project. And potentially there is the opportunity to see this really realistically delivered within the next 3 years through that project in Greater Manchester. So we're part of the Ignition project, which Johnny's going to talk a little bit more about later. And realistically, there's a real opportunity to now scale this up across all non-domestic properties in Greater Manchester.
Excellent.
Was that less than 10 minutes?
Just about. Thanks very much, Amanda.
No problem.
If anyone's got any questions, we've got some time in at the end to actually have a bit of a discussion about everything. So if you can hold on till then, that would be appreciated to just keep us moving nice and quickly. Same challenge to you, Tom. You've got less than 10 minutes this time as well.
So hi, I'm Tom Curtis, and I'm going to talk about the Landscape Enterprise Networks approach, which is something that we've been developing and working with United Utilities and other people like Nestle, and also business in the community. Amanda's been very involved. We've been developing it up in Cumbria. It's in the government's 5-year environment plan, cited in that. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Lens today, and I'm going to talk to you about how we're working now to look at how it might be applied as a useful tool within the context of Greater Manchester. So So Lens is about creating business value from healthy landscapes, but actually in the process of doing that, the other side of that coin is it's about driving investment in healthy landscapes by mobilising their value to business. And essentially its focus is about creating value chains, getting revenue flows going essentially between demand on the one side for outcomes and quality of landscapes and people who can deliver services against that from the landscape. Where did it come from? So Lens came from initially a discussion we were having with Nestlé up in Cumbria. They have a big milk processing plant at a place called Dalston up there. And we were talking to Nestlé as three as consultants of two big areas of work we do. One of those areas is sustainability risk profiling, essentially for businesses. We were doing that for Nestlé. The other area of expertise we have, and particularly my area, is in land management. My background's in forestry and farming, and we do land capability assessments and we were trying to make sense for Nestlé of where their dependencies in that landscape lie. And we're looking at a sort of our normal approach to that, to thinking about landscapes, think about the assets in those landscapes in terms of land capability, think about the functions that come out of those assets, and then think about, well, who are the beneficiaries who benefit from those and therefore could be customers of those landscapes. And essentially in the context of the Dalston plant for Nestlé, we were turning that assessment on its head, and we were starting with the beneficiary and sort of doing that sustainability risk mapping for them. But looking at them as a beneficiary, thinking about what are the functions they require from the landscape around there. Well, they require a number of functions from that landscape, and they require that landscape to be of high quality and performance in order to deliver things like milk, basically. If there's no milk coming off that landscape, there's no fertility in that landscape, then they have a stranded asset there, essentially. They also need the landscape to be able to function for their workforce and also for logistics, so they can't have it flooding either. And obviously effluent management, that sort of thing is really important for them. So we can start to look at the landscape from their perspective. And the reason we do that is because it creates a business case. So that actually they will start to put real money into investing in the assets that underpin those functions in that landscape. The soils, the habitat infrastructure that helps manage those functional outcomes. That's the first key tenet of Lens. That's the first of two key tenets of Lens, essentially, it's customer focused. We're building an investment proposition based on an understanding of the customer, the people who want to put the money in. The second key tenet was that very rapidly we understood that there are probably other businesses from other sectors in northern Cumbria who've also got an interest in those same assets in that landscape, in the soils in that landscape, in the habitats within that landscape and the functions that they provide. And actually those businesses, water companies obviously, and this is where we come to, but also other businesses from other sectors, actually then become potential co-investors in those landscape assets, in underpinning them, perhaps for different functional reasons, but the key thing is same asset. And so that's the second tenet of Lens. So the first one is customer focus. The second one is we find co-investment opportunities. And that's really important. It's important in terms of scale to really get enough investment into the landscape to shift the needle on these sorts of outcomes. And it's important also in terms of the psychology of investment. No business wants to be the one that's carrying the can for the whole landscape. If you start to build a coalition of businesses who can co-invest into it, then actually you don't just increase the size of the pot, but additionally, actually those businesses are more willing to invest more because they're not being mugs, basically. So the initial step with the Lens is an opportunity analysis, is looking at the network of interactions between beneficiaries, the functions they require, and the assets that underpin those functions. And then we find, well, where's the hottest, where's the greatest need there? Where are the people who have the most commonality of interest? And where we find real commonality of interest and willingness to start playing the game, then we start to build a value chain that connects those things up. And this is really where the work is mostly at. It's this basic operating unit of building a first value chain that cuts through those vectors, those links in that landscape network. We're not going to try to do the whole thing once. We're going to build one value chain first. And so essentially what that involves is we understand business needs. We understand where those businesses are coming from, what the functions they need from the landscape. And when we understand those, we can map on where those overlap, basically. Aggregate their demand, build a bigger pot, basically. Convene businesses around their common interests. And that's the first big job of work. The next thing we do is we build a technical understanding of what that means in the landscape, where in the landscape in terms of those assets, therefore, underpins their common interest, and what kind of interventions can we put in that that are going to deliver for them? What kind of change or what kind of action do we need to be able to deliver against their common interest? And essentially, what that creates is a service specification for services. This is what collectively these guys are up to paying for. And having got that specification defined, then we can go to people who pull together land managers, farmers in the landscape, or people who can influence land outcomes, and get them to pull together those players, those land managers, to be able to aggregate their services, to put together collectively a service proposition that's relevant to and meets the demand on that side. It's very transactional. It's essentially saying, these guys together have this need, it's worth something to them. These guys can come up with something which deliver against that need, and therein lies the potential for a deal, basically. You can cut a deal. It's somewhere somewhat less than it's worth to these people, and somewhere somewhat more than it costs these people to do it, is your price point. It's not an accounting exercise, it's a straightforward business transaction. And that's what we're cutting this down to, is to create these straightforward business transactions and build complexity from there. And that's our experience, that's where we're at the moment, that's where we're at in Cumbria, we're down in Hampshire Avon as well. That's the basic operating unit within Lens, that's how it builds up. So essentially, it's about demand aggregation, the jobs of work in it, but putting demand together, understanding where that shared demand is, and technically what that means in terms of the service proposition, then working with supply aggregators. We work with a range of different people, like farmer clusters, Game Wildlife Conservation Trust, but also a milk co-op up in Cumbria, to put those together. And then the other bit we do is we get in the switchgear, and we're working with N-Trade at the moment to put in the switchgear, which enables you actually to make those trades happen. That's the basic operating unit. Obviously, landscapes are multifunctional. We need them to be more multifunctional and multifaceted and dynamic. And so the idea is you build complexity over time. You can add in additional specialist supply aggregators for different functions, put in entirely new value chains with other private sector interests which may or may not overlap with our initial service providers, and also and put in and build up incrementally complexity over time. And the opportunity here is also that some of those beneficiaries, some of those people procuring on the demand side, they may be public sector, they don't have to be private sector, they could be public sector purely, it could be public and private sector blended approaches to procure out of that landscape. But essentially the thing is that it starts from and it builds up with this single operating unit, this value chain basically. We build complexity from there.
2 minutes, Tom.
Yeah, right. Oh golly, I've really gone on this time, haven't I? So how does that look in Manchester? Well, Manchester is big and complex. 2.7 million people, £59 billion economy. So actually you need a mechanism that deals with complexity. And I think that's where Lens comes in really well. Essentially, multiple beneficiaries, sectors, multiple functions, and also delivered in landscape assets which are configured within the city itself, in the immediate hinterland, but then also right up across the wider region. Obviously, the obvious one is that most of Manchester's water comes from the Lake District, comes from Haweswater, Thirlmere. So big opportunities to put that sort of stuff together. How do we get to that? The way we get to that with Lens is we focus in on a particular location, we focus in on the particular needs of beneficiaries within a location, understand their demands, understand where those overlap, and understand where that alights into the landscape. So we looked at Bolton, and we started talking to people in Bolton, we started talking to people on the demand side and on the supply side. But we start with the demand side, and understanding United Utilities, developers, big employers, Bolton City Council, who are putting £1 billion into regeneration within the city centre and its development around that. Between them, there's a lot of collective interest there in catchment management functions, as you might imagine, flooding and nutrient management, in order to be able to develop and to manage. And there's a lot of collective interest in placemaking outcomes. And from a catchment management perspective, the assets that underpin that are both within the urban landscape, and within the peri-urban landscape, around that landscape, and there are a range of different supply chain, supply side players who can deliver against that. And similarly, with assets, both in the urban environment context and in the peri-urban context, that deliver that. So actually, what you have there is the makings of some value chains, and that's essentially what Lens does. It tracks those through, puts the switchgear in, and links up the demand that we've got here through to the relevant bits of the assets that deliver against it, and builds up value essentially and gets transactions going. And that's what Lens is about, starting like that and then growing out. Sorry, I have gone over, I'm sure.
That's all right. Okay, so we'll keep moving quite quickly, and we'll get Johnny to come and talk about Ignition, which is hopefully going to give you a bit of understanding for what the proposals are to take us forward, how we can link these sort of things in to develop that, and a bit of the wider nature-based solution stuff. Again, less than 10 minutes. Try and approach it in the same way Amanda did rather than the way Tom did.
Thanks, Jim. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Johnny Sadler. I'm the Programme Director at the Manchester Climate Change Agency. We help the city to set and meet climate change targets. It's the simplest way to describe what we do. What I'd like to do this afternoon is just very briefly put today's conference in an EU context, actually, and talk about how what we're doing and looking to do here in Greater Manchester is right at the cutting edge of what any city in the EU is looking to do at the moment around innovative financing. So this is a document from about 3 years ago. It's a European Commission document which essentially launched what they call their nature-based solutions agenda. The idea with nature-based solutions is that nature can deliver a wide range of benefits and provide a solution to a wide range of problems in urban areas. It's largely analogous with the term green infrastructure, natural capital, so let's not worry too much about the subtle differences between different terms there. For us, it's green stuff in the urban environment. What the Commission are really interested in is demonstrating the value that you get from green infrastructure in an urban environment. They're doing that through funding the delivery of some demonstration projects. They also want to build an evidence base, coherent evidence base across the EU that sets out what green stuff does in the urban environment. They want to see more cities delivering and maintaining high quality green infrastructure, and they want the EU to be recognised as a global leader on this agenda. So they're putting something like 100 million euros into projects at the moment on nature-based solutions. Manchester is leading one of the projects in that programme, the Grow Green project, about 11 million euros, working with 22 partners over a 5-year period. And stripping the complexity out of that, what that project is about is helping our partner cities and others to develop and implement green infrastructure strategies. It's as simple as that. As part of that work, we've started to do a more detailed understanding of what are the ingredients that need to go into a city's green infrastructure strategy. We've boiled it down so far to these 8 things. Invariably, cities and their partners can do the majority of things that need to be on that list. Establishing the views of stakeholders, spatial planning, etc., the kind of nuts and bolts, bread and butter stuff of local government. But invariably, where those strategies start to fall down is real gaps around business models, sustainable financing options, and delivery and maintenance mechanisms that will enable projects to be delivered at the rate and scale that's needed. So we find that across our 7 EU and Chinese partner cities and across other cities that we talk to. This is just a little bit of insight from another one of the projects in that €100 million programme. It's the Naturevation project led by Durham University. It's particularly focused on business models and financing. And what they've done as a first step is they've looked across about 100 cities within the EU, about 1,000 different projects, and what they've tried to do is understand what are the characteristics of those projects and where does the money come from. And there's 2 kind of headlines I want to draw out for you from one of their reports. Increasingly, cities are delivering green infrastructure projects based on the fact that they deliver multiple benefits. So it's not just about flood risk, it's not just about biodiversity, it's not just about health, It's about multiple benefits, something we've heard a lot about earlier on today. And secondly, one of the headlines I want to draw out is this point about where the money is currently coming from. It's predominantly coming from within the public sector, and particularly local authorities, be that grant funding or public sector services, service budgets. Now, in the context of overall reductions to public sector spending, you can probably guess what's going to be on my next slide. That over-reliance on public funding is leading to cities not addressing the challenges that they face. So you look at this from a climate adaptation perspective, across all the different climatic zones in the EU, there is no city that is yet adapting to climate change at the rate that it needs to. So the 7 different climatic zones that the European Environment Agency look at, all of them are experiencing increased risk and impact from climate change. Manchester's no different, 10-fold increase in surface water flooding today compared to 50 years ago, and a doubling in the number of heat stress incidents. So there's a number of factors why that's the case, but one of them is the fact that we haven't yet got the funding right for the delivery and maintenance of green infrastructure projects in cities. So this is where I want to just start to move into the Ignition project. I've mentioned the fact that Manchester is already viewed as a leader on this agenda by the EU through the Grow Green project, also through the Natural Course project. So what we've started to say is, given that position, what could we do to try to genuinely move this agenda on in a way that helps deliver our local objectives, but in a way which might also support the EU cities? So what we're looking to do through the Ignition project is take the concept that the Commission used for sustainable energy projects, so energy efficiency projects, renewables, district heating, and apply that here. And the way that those energy projects work is that is a fairly well-established, mature market with pretty well-tried and tested technologies. You know what a solar panel is going to do when you stick it in your roof. On that basis, the European Commission have put €97 million of project development assistance into cities over the last 10 years. That's enabled cities to develop investable projects, which is then being invested into the tune of €5.5 billion. So it's an incredibly good use of public funding. You've got a 55 times leverage rate there. And what we're saying here is that given that nature-based solutions have got we've got an increasingly robust understanding of the economic benefits they provide, could a tree as a technology or a green roof as a technology, does that offer a sufficiently robust return on investment so that we could try to establish that as a market in the same way that a sustainable energy market already exists? So we've asked for some money from the Commission to effectively set up a project development assistance project to develop investable green infrastructure projects in Manchester on the basis that we can then secure capital investment. So entirely the same model that already exists for energy. That